I want you to think about the last time you sat down to do something that required real concentration and you just couldn't get going. You're not tired, not stressed exactly, just flat, like someone had turned the brightness down in your brain. Most people in that situation do one of two things. They grab another coffee or they just tell themselves to push on through and work harder. Look, I've done both and neither of them really work, because if your brain is being quietly undermined by what you've been feeding it, no amount of caffeine or willpower is going to fix that. You're trying to solve a physiological problem with a psychological solution. Now, before we go any further, I want to be really clear about something. This isn't supposed to be a diet video. It's not a protocol. And I'm not going to tell you to eat 17 different superfoods or drink some expensive shake that tastes like I got it out the back of my lawnmower. What I want to do is explain exactly what's happening inside your brain when your nutrition consistently works against you, and what you can do about it that's genuinely practical and evidence-based. Because look, here's the thing that most people kind of miss, I guess, is what's good for your brain is almost always good for your heart, your body, your longevity, and your long-term general health. So these aren't separate conversations, they're the same one. Now, there's one mechanism that connects almost everything I'm going to talk about in this video. And I'm going to start here because I think once you understand this, everything else makes a bit more sense. So your brain has its own resident immune cells. They're called microglia. And under normal conditions, they're essential, right? They maintain your brain health, they support neuroplasticity and clear out all that junk, all that cellular waste. You can think of them, I guess, as like your brain's maintenance and repair crew. But here's what's happening when your diet is consistently working against you. A diet high in ultra-processed foods, refined sugar and poor quality fats drives this chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body. Now that inflammation reaches the brain, and when it does, those microglia become overactive or overactivated. Instead of maintaining and repairing, they start releasing these pro-inflammatory molecules that kind of interfere with how your neurons communicate. And that result is exactly what most people would describe as brain fog. That kind of slower thinking, difficulty concentrating, that you feel flat, low output, everything feels a bit more of an effort. And this isn't just about daily performance. Chronic neuroinflammation driven by poor diet is strongly linked in the research to long-term cognitive decline like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and accelerated brain aging. Now, a study published in 2024 in Neurology found that people who ate the highest amount of ultra-processed foods were significantly more likely to experience cognitive impairment over time. And then a 2025 meta-analysis showed a 25 to 35% higher risk of dementia in those who ate the most ultra-processed foods. And this isn't a niche concern, it's one of the most well-evidenced nutrition risks we have. But the good news is that the dietary changes that reduce the inflammation don't just protect your brain. Like, they reduce your risk of heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and to be honest, like most chronic diseases simultaneously. It really is the same conversation. One of the most direct drivers of that inflammatory cycle is blood sugar instability. Now, your brain runs primarily on glucose. Unlike your muscles, which can switch fuel sources fairly easily, your brain has limited ability to do that. Now, under certain circumstances, like extended fasting or a long-term ketogenic diet, it can adopt and use ketones as an alternative fuel. But for most people, eating a normal mixed diet, glucose is what your brain runs on, and the consistency of that, it really, really matters. Now, the problem is that for most busy professionals, their relationship with blood sugar is, to put it mildly, a bit of a mess. You grab something convenient and probably sugary for breakfast, blood sugar spikes, energy feels okay briefly, then it crashes, right? Then you reach for a coffee or something sweet again, and you pretty much repeat this until about 3 p.m. when everything just grinds to a halt. Now, those spikes and crashes don't just affect energy, they directly impair concentration. They also affect working memory and decision making. And each crash triggers a low-grade inflammatory response that feeds back into the microglia activation that we talked about earlier. Now, I want to address something directly because I know a lot of people are doing intermittent fasting or eating 2 meals a day and functioning really well, And they're right to question the old advice that eating every few hours is the way to do it. because the evidence doesn't support a specific meal frequency as being universally optimal. What matters is metabolic stability, not how many times you eat. You know, if you're doing 2 meals a day and your blood sugar is stable, your energy feels consistent and your inflammation is low, then that's working for you, right? Intermittent fasting done well is genuinely supported by really good evidence, you know, including improved insulin sensitivity, reduced inflammation, increased BDNF, and support for your brain's own cellular repair process. What doesn't work is erratic eating patterns, you know, skipping meals and then binging on poor quality food, or building a day around sugar and ultra processed snacks. You know, that's the pattern that drives the inflammatory cycle. The question isn't how often you eat, it's whether what you eat keeps your blood sugar stable and your inflammation low. That's the important thing. So blood sugar stability and low inflammation give your brain the conditions it needs to function properly. But what your brain actually does with those conditions, you know, how it focuses, motivates itself and responds under pressure, that depends on its chemistry. And that chemistry is built from something that most people genuinely aren't really thinking about. Now, your brain communicates using neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, and acetylcholine. These are the chemicals that drive focus, motivation, mood, and the ability to think clearly under pressure. So all the stuff you need for work and stuff. Now, these neurotransmitters are built from amino acids. To be clear, this isn't a case of eat more protein today and you'll feel sharper by lunchtime. But when protein intake is consistently low over time, your brain's ability to produce these chemicals is really genuinely affected. It's cumulative rather than immediate, but it's absolutely real and you'll definitely feel it. So dopamine, which drives motivation and attention, is built from an amino acid called tyrosine. And then serotonin, which affects mood stability and the ability to stay calm under pressure, that comes from tryptophan. And then acetylcholine, which is critical for learning and memory, that's mainly found in dietary choline, like eggs and liver and meat. Now, a practical daily protein target for most people is around 1.5 to 2 grams of protein per kilo of your ideal body weight per day. Now, that's almost certainly more than most people are currently eating. And spreading it across meals, you know, whatever number of meals that is for you, helps your brain maintain consistent access to those building blocks right throughout your day. So your inflammatory environment, your blood sugar stability, and your neurotransmitter chemistry all really matter, right? But there's one more layer that ties directly back to inflammation. And it might be where most people's diets are doing the most kind of damage. Your brain is around 60% fat. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean, it literally, structurally, the membranes of your brain cells are largely made up of fatty acids, and the quality of those membranes directly affects how efficiently your neurons communicate with each other. Omega-3 fatty acids, particularly EPA and DHA, are the most critical. And I want to be precise about why, because I think most people think of them as primarily structural. But their most important role for daily cognitive performance is anti-inflammatory. So DHA and EPA actively regulate those microglial activation we talked about earlier. They're some of the most potent dietary anti-inflammatory tools that we have, which is why virtually every serious longevity and performance researcher lists them as non-negotiable. But your body can't produce DHA in meaningful quantities. You have to get it from food. Oily fish is definitely the best source, so things like mackerel, salmon, anchovies, sardines. But if that's not part of your regular diet, then this is an area where supplementation is pretty well justified. You know, buying a good quality fish oil, probably providing 1 or 2 grams of combined EPA and DHA per day, that would be a really good investment for you. Now, here's the other side of this. A diet consistently high in ultra-processed foods is typically high in omega-6 fatty acids, usually from refined seed oils. Now, you do need some omega-6, but the ratio between omega-6 and omega-3 has shifted so dramatically in our modern diets, and this imbalance is one of the most consistent dietary drivers of chronic neuroinflammation. And it also increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and metabolic dysfunction. So the consequences of this imbalance to the brain and body are the same, right? They're not good. Now, the practical point is simple. Eat more oily fish or supplement with fish oil. Reduce ultra-processed foods and refined seed oils especially. And this is one of the highest leverage dietary changes you can make for both brain and body in terms of performance and health. And there's one more layer that I really want to cover. The science here has moved so quickly over the last decade or so, and I honestly find it fascinating. So your gut and your brain are in a constant two-way communication, primarily via the vagus nerve. And the state of your gut microbiome has a direct influence on your brain's inflammatory environment. When your gut microbiome is disrupted by a diet high in ultra-processed foods, low in fiber, or if you're chronically stressed, the gut lining can become more permeable. And that allows these bacterial endotoxins into the bloodstream. And that triggers systemic inflammation, which then activates those microglia that we were talking about earlier. So the gut isn't a separate issue. It's another route into exactly the same inflammatory cycle that we've been talking about throughout this video. So you might have heard that around 90% of your body's serotonin is produced in the gut. Now, this is basically true, but I think it's worth being a bit more precise about it because the gut-produced serotonin doesn't directly cross the blood-brain barrier. Now, the relationship between gut health and brain chemistry is definitely real, but it works through the vagus nerve and other signaling pathways rather than a direct kind of serotonin top-up. Look, the mechanism matters less than the point that I'm actually trying to make, which is that a disrupted gut creates a more inflamed, less stable environment for your brain to operate in. The fix is genuinely pretty straightforward, right? A diverse diet rich in whole foods, vegetables, legumes, and fermented foods like yogurt and kimchi and kefir and that kind of stuff, that supports a healthier microbiome, which keeps that inflammatory pathway kind of quieter. And this is also exactly the dietary pattern associated with reduced risk of virtually every chronic disease you can think of. I think a nice way to think about this is that you're not just feeding yourself, you're feeding the ecosystem that determines how inflamed or how calm your brain's environment is every single day. So we've covered what you eat and how it shapes your brain's inflammatory environment, but there's one more dimension to all of this that I think most nutrition completely ignores, and that's when you eat. Every cell in your body runs on a circadian clock, and that's synchronized to the light-dark cycle we get from the sun. Now, your body is designed to process food most effectively or efficiently during daylight hours. And as evening approaches, your metabolism shifts towards repair and recovery rather than digestion and energy production. So eating like large amounts of food late in the evening or at night, that disrupts the system. You know, it delays glucose rhythms, it elevates cortisol when cortisol should be falling, and it disrupts conditions needed for quality sleep. And it increases systemic inflammation, which we've been talking about. And that means that what you eat in the evening can directly undermine how your brain functions the following day. Now, this doesn't mean that you can never eat after 7 p.m, but there is solid evidence showing that keeping your eating window roughly in line with daylight hours and avoiding large, heavy or carbohydrate-heavy meals close to bedtime supports better sleep, lower inflammation, and more consistent next-day cognitive performance. Now, if you're doing intermittent fasting, an earlier window, say 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. or similar, is likely to be more beneficial than a late window, both for sleep quality and for metabolic health. Now, the brain research on time-restricted eating is pretty promising, and it's an approach that doesn't require counting calories or eating more or weird foods. It's simply about alignment with your biology. Now, let's try and make this a bit more practical, a bit more useful for you. Now, the most important shift I would encourage is stop thinking about nutrition as something separate from cognitive performance. You know, every meal is either reducing or it's increasing the inflammation that determines how well your brain functions. That reframe alone changes how you make decisions about food. So here's what this might look like in practice for a busy professional, say. So you want to prioritize protein at every meal. Eggs at breakfast, for example, give you protein, healthy fats, and choline all in one go. And remember, for protein, we're aiming for around 1.5 to 2 grams per kilo of body weight, spread across however many meals works for you. You want to get oily fish into your diet at least twice a week. And if you can't, I recommend supplementing with a high quality fish oil that provides about 2 grams of EPA and DHA daily. Remember, this is your most valuable anti-inflammatory intervention. Definitely try and reduce ultra-processed foods as much as you practically can. Not because you're trying to reduce the calories necessarily, but because of the inflammatory load. You know, All of the refined seed oils, the additives, the hidden sugars that disrupt your gut microbiome and blood sugar instability. Definitely try and reduce your ultra-processed food as much as you practically can. Not necessarily because you're trying to reduce the calories, but because of the inflammatory load. You know, all of the refined seed oils, the additives, the hidden sugars that disrupt your gut microbiome and your blood sugar instability. You also want to eat within a window that's broadly aligned with daylight hours. You know, you don't need to be rigid about that, but avoiding large meals late at night will improve your sleep quality and reduce inflammatory burden in the morning that follows. Keep your eating pattern consistent, you know, whether that's 2 meals or 3 meals or 4 meals or whatever works for you. Your body and your brain like routine. And if you are doing intermittent fasting and it works for you, the evidence supports it, right? The key is that your meals within that window are nutritionally solid. You know, a 16-hour fast followed by ultra-processed food is not a healthy strategy. So the next time you sit down to do something that really matters and your brain just doesn't cooperate, before you make another coffee or just tell yourself to focus harder or concentrate more, it's worth asking a simpler question. What have you been giving your brain to work with? Because in most cases, it's not a focus problem or a motivation problem. It's a physiological one. You know, the brain you sit down with every morning is largely a product of the environment you've been creating for it through what you eat, when you eat, and what you don't eat. Now, that's actually really good news because environments are pretty easy to be changed, right? Now, if you want to go deeper into the practical side of this, you know, how to structure your nutrition in a way that genuinely supports how your brain performs on a day-to-day basis, that's exactly what we work through inside the Fit Mind community, which is my community on School. It's completely free to join and it's where the coaching happens. I'll leave a link below for you. Next week, we're talking about sleep. Not the usual kind of get 8 hours of sleep sort of advice, but what's actually happening inside your brain when you don't sleep properly is one of the most important and maybe overlooked areas of cognitive performance. So I'll see you then.